For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Jeff here with something it's just exactly what the doctor ordered when you replay the last number of years of our conversations, and those have been around power reliability, power costs, power systems. We're super lucky today to have Peter Lake. He's the former chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Texas. Not only that, he came in at Governor Abbott's request right after Uri, and so he had a difficult challenge ahead of him when he took that on. But he's also former chairman of the Texas Water Development Board, so he's got a lot of experience between both water and power in Texas. And as you all know, Texas is one of the largest economies in the world. So to have that experience is pretty fascinating. He's a young guy, he's a talented guy, and Peter, we're just delighted to have you join us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we can't wait to jump in. We've got this new setup here. The four of us will see if we can remember which way to look. Albert, our creative director, says he's going to figure it out no matter what. Mike, before we jump in with Peter, what would you tell us about the markets, the world? I know we've just jumped into earnings season here.
Yeah, Maynard, this is going to be unusual for me, but I'm going to say this has been a pretty non-volatile type week. It's a very slow week right now. We're just starting to get into earnings, but there's really no economic stats. We usually talk about bonds to start off, and the one thing I would say is, bonds have gone from 3.6% the 10-year a month ago to 4.2%. Who would have thought that? People were saying bonds are going to keep going down, Fed's going to be cutting rates, and that's not what's happening. The bond market now is seeing some of the economic stats that have come out. They're looking better than expected, so I think most people are expecting 75 basis points of cuts before year end. It sounds like that's being dialed back right now. The market's gone up to 4.2% on a 10-year, and so I think what's happening here is stock market has had a great run. They're looking at rates now. We're entering earnings season, so I think, and we're 2 weeks away from presidential election. I think people are basically saying, you know what, we're stepping to the sidelines at this point in time, and so I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the market this week for just the Dow's probably off today about 50, 60, 75 basis point, 75 points, but you're seeing the S&P is down about 0.5% this week, and so it's just kind of going sideways. And there's really, like I said, no economic stats, no real earnings of note. And so that's kind of where we are. From an energy standpoint, we are just getting to earnings season. And we talked about this last week that the companies that have reported are some of the oil service companies, and activity there is being adjusted lower, pricing is being adjusted lower, and earnings are going lower. So those stocks have underperformed. We're getting into the meat of earnings period now for the energy companies. We've got a bunch of oil service companies this week. We have a couple natural gas E&Ps this week, one refiner reports, couple electric utilities. So it's going to be a really broad mix this week of stuff. And then next week, we really get into the heat of, the meat of the earnings. We're going to have a bunch of E&Ps, oil majors. And so next week, stay tuned next week. And then, like I said, we'll be a week away from the election next week. And so it'll be very interesting. But right now, like I said, I think people are stepping to the sidelines, seeing how things play out with the election, and then they'll start placing some bets.
Okay, awesome. Jeff, anything you'd throw in before we jump in?
I mean, Mike talked about, relatively boring week. I think, what I'm fascinated by is just the massive sentiment change in and around nuclear. We had, it's been evolving and moving that way. There had been optimism around kind of existing capacity, but just in the last few weeks, whether it's 3 Mile Island, some of the tech offtake contracts, or the direct investment in some of the business via the tech companies, all that's awesome, but the sentiment change is fascinating. And don't know if we're going into overhyped territory, but it's just got to be cognizant of just whether it's supply chain, regulatory, fuel dynamics, the commercial dynamics of the companies. Got to make sure we're staying balanced and realistic about what the opportunity is and when it may materialize.
No, it's a great point. It is. It's stunning how the nuclear world keeps changing. Well, Peter, let's jump in. Thanks for coming to visit. We are. As I was hitting there in the intro, the number of times in these discussions where we've talked about power systems, Public Utility Commission decision making, energy grids around the world, it has been the dominant flavor really over the last 2 years. So to get a guy who has been on the inside of that, particularly after Uri, it's a great honor for us.
Well, I appreciate you having me here, and I really appreciate you highlighting the fact that I didn't start at the Public Utility Commission until after Uri. That's a key point.
No, it is a key point. I mean, you were kind of, I don't know what the analogy is, but the coach, the governor, had to make a change after all that, and you were the guy who had to step into that.
Yeah, I appreciate the governor's trust, but it was certainly much more of an adventure than I anticipated.
You know, one thing it's interesting, and I want to thank Bill Flores for connecting us to you. I hadn't appreciated the structure. Maybe most people do that. As the chair of the Public Utility Commission, you're also on the board of ERCOT. You're a non-voting board member, but it's sort of a synchronized way to do it. But so I didn't mention that, but you... Sure,
and that's one of the really unique things about Texas and ERCOT. If you look at just the peaking megawatt load of ERCOT, it's probably the 7th or 8th largest power grid on the planet behind India, China, Europe. So it's bigger than California and New York State combined. And probably bigger than Germany. It's a huge power grid. And before the storm, ERCOT was kind of on its own as an outside entity with its own board, its own governance. But of course, after the storm, the legislature changed that. And so not only does the PUC chairman and now an additional PUC commissioner sit on the ERCOT board, but almost all of the ERCOT board decisions, and it's a new board structure with a selection. The board is now selected by the legislature. That board essentially has to send their decisions to the PUC. So ERCOT is unique in that Texas being largely outside of FERC jurisdiction, the PUC of Texas plays the role of the regulator, which is in many ways FERC, also the grid operator with direct oversight of ERCOT, which the legislature made clear after Uri, and also the market manager, which is usually the ISO. And so in the rest of the country, those jobs are split up between FERC, the state PUCs, and the ISOs. But in Texas, it's all in one spot.
So we mentioned it. You get pulled in post Uri. Maybe take us back to that time. How much was on the table to be changed? You know, how much the legislature was getting involved, the governor was getting involved. Take us back to what was the art of the possible at that time, like, and from a leadership perspective, what was it like to step into? That was a rough time. You know, a lot of confusion, a lot of anger,
a lot of fear.
That
was almost unprecedented tragedy in Texas history, both in terms of lives lost, but also the economic damage and people Texans still have read that fear of how bad that was resonate. So that was a really scary time. And at the time I was chairman of the Water Development Board, and so was familiar with the governor and his team, and had been leading one of his major agencies. And I think, and this is the part where I tell people at that time I had zero experience in the power industry, zero. And I've made that point clear to the governor the first 2 times I declined his offer to take the job. But he was insistent, and he's a very thoughtful, high integrity guy, and he was insistent that this job would be more about change leadership than any particular subject matter expertise. And
that is pretty incredible. That he was grabbing you and you didn't necessarily have that background.
Zero.
What was his? You just touched on it, but what was his mindset like? I got to have this guy, even though you might have said, I got to have the world's leading expert on power, system integrity and, lots of granular stuff.
But I think there aren't many other places in the world that have a grid of that scale with that penetration of renewables. So there's really nowhere else to look. And the governor very much wanted fresh eyes. Mm-hmm. He recognized there were a lot of kind of sacred cows and incumbents, and so he wanted fresh eyes. And most importantly, he knew it was a change leadership, and that's across. And if you look at it from kind of the perspective of a corporate turnaround, right? You've got a massive refinancing that you need to do in the multi-billion-dollar securitization that the legislature smartly passed. You've got well over $10 billion of legal challenges in litigation. You've got a very complex operating machine that needs to be reoriented, recalibrated because we don't know what the right answer is, but we know we can't do it that way. The way we used to do it, ISOs are largely tech companies, so you've got a big technical kind of software optimization challenge, and you've got a cultural challenge. Because at the time, you remember you still need the folks at ERCOT to run ERCOT. And those employees and those people who were working hard through the storm have just been through a lot themselves. And so that was I think the governor looked at it as very much like a corporate, almost a corporate turnaround.
So now the flip question, why did you take it? I know you tried to say no twice, but it sounds like such a difficult job.
It was incredibly difficult. I declined the first 2 times. The governor was insistent, and we came to an understanding that I wasn't going to be there an extremely long time, but it was an important enough job that he needed the right person that he had confidence in and he trusted, and it was too important of a job for the state of Texas to not get right.
And is that the kind of thing, because the legislature was doing its own thinking about the structure and all this stuff, like how did you, the governor's appointing you, but he had to think about how's this guy going to get along with the legislature? Like what are those dynamics like?
A lot of that was, I suspect, I don't know the governor's thinking, but a lot of that was being a known quantity at the Capitol. I led the Water Development Board through Hurricane Harvey, and more importantly, and worked with the legislature extensively on the flood infrastructure, which was a major initiative. So a lot of time with the legislature. So I was a known quantity, and so I think that helped. Well,
we touched on this when you first sat down before we turned on the camera and the mics, but you, at the water board, the governor had said, hey, Hurricane Harvey is something I need you to focus on. So your life has been kind of Hurricane Harvey, and then we got to do COVID, and then you did Uri, kind of an incredible set of problems there.
Whatever lucky straw I drew, I got the 2 biggest disasters in Texas history back to back, or in recent Texas history.
Just unbelievable. On your choice, and I think this is kind of what you were implying, but maybe these are just my words, but if you had been a power executive or a renewables investor or, whatever, somebody with some experience, you would have kind of, because the post-Uri experience, other than the tragedy of it, it was also characterized by people saying, it was that system went wrong, or that flavor went wrong, or this was the culprit. And so it had this finger pointing by flavor environment, and if you'd had some experience which linked you to a flavor, it might have been harder for you to do the job. Is that fair?
I think that's right, and the governor recognized that a fresh perspective, a fresh face was important in that moment, in that time. And there was a big market component of it, and so that was definitely part of it, and we can get into all the things that went wrong if that's helpful at some point.
Well, I feel like a
lot of people
the world goes over it. I'm never sure that we've officially put it to bed as what went wrong, because people to this day still have. But maybe take us back to the time now, because I think the other thing that's sort of fascinating in all this is, like, the main thing we talk about today, I bet, top of the masthead, is the cost of power around the world and how it's going up, and people aren't appreciating that. But this was a time when reliability had just left us. And so reliability was top of the pecking order.
Yeah.
Take us to those meetings and that planning, and like how you just started getting immersed in all this and deciding, okay, what do I need to do first?
Well, the answer to that is everything now, which was a staggering challenge. And if you go back to day one, the Senate moved quickly, got my confirmation, and we had to scramble to kind of fill out the paperwork and all that. And at kind of on day one in late April of 2021, if you remember, ERCOT was still sending out statewide conservation notices on a pretty regular basis. So there was not only was it not we're out of the woods, but ERCOT was still telling 25 million Texans, hey, we don't think we have power for today. There was no CEO of ERCOT at the time. The board, the old board, had very much kind of been sidelined by the legislature. And so it was all of the things I mentioned. We've got the litigation, we've got to work with the legislature to get the securitization done, and you've got to make sure these folks keep coming to work, because some of them are beat up pretty bad. Not sure they want to work here anymore.
Like how many people work at ERCOT?
700, 800.
And basically, when you stepped in, it's an organization without leadership?
Absolutely. It took us a few days to identify Brad Jones, who I know has been here before, and he was absolutely instrumental in getting us from day one to now. And a lot of folks don't remember, not during the storm. I know y'all are familiar with how close we came to a total failure, 4 minutes and 37 seconds away from a black start. Mm-hmm. And that is a universal failure. 25 million people without power for weeks at best. And that means you've got no heat, you've got no refrigeration for food, you can't get water pumped to your house, you can't get sewage out of your house, you can't get gasoline out of the pump. So that was a really, it's people kind of, you move on and things have worked well since then, but it was a really scary time. So you've got to do all the things that you normally have to do with a massive corporate turnaround, but you've still got to run the grid day to day. 24/7, 365. Yeah. You can't delay a product launch. You can't cancel a flight, or you can't, like a lot of businesses have kind of some release valves, yeah. But it's got to, the 7th largest economy in the world's got to be powered all day, every day. And the feedback loop for failure is instantaneous. And how many people work at the PUC? Like that whole organization is how big? Maybe 200 at the time. Mm-hmm. It was probably budgeted for 200, but it was probably 150, 170. It's a little bit bigger now. So you had to step in and kind of stabilize those people, keep everybody doing their jobs. I guess luckily it was April, so maybe the coldest weather was behind us. But what quickly became your next? Because I think the mindset at the time was like, oh God, now we're going into summer. We cannot have another outage. And I bet everybody would have, at that time, said 75% chance we have another outage. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so I got very lucky in Brad Jones being willing to come out of retirement, and blessed that he was willing to teach me so much that he did. And he was a great guy to have working for me. I got very lucky in the PUC leadership team, Thomas Gleason and Connie Corona and the team there, because remember, I have no experience in this industry at all. So a lot of this is me learning from them, but I've also got a massive stakeholder universe between the legislature, the market participants, the consumers. The industrial consumers are a big part of the state's economy and a big part of the ERCOT ecosystem that I've got to meet with, learn from, engage from. Met with all the former PUC commissioners. I was grateful that they would share their wisdom, even if they had moved on. Met with the former CEO of ERCOT. So a lot of that was learning. Mm-hmm. And, but we also had to run the kind of the operating company. But it was, it was 12, 14-hour days at the office, and then I'd go home and spend 4 or 6 hours reading up on the industry, trying to get up the learning curve. And how much just turnover was in the PUC during all this? There was a good amount out of the gates at both ERCOT and PUC. I don't remember the actual kind of, but a significant at the leadership levels. It jumped very quickly. Yeah. And that was, in some cases that was challenging, but in some cases, just in any kind of turnaround situation, there are parts where you need to prune a little bit, and there's some parts where you need to nurture and grow a little bit. So there was definitely some pruning that went on appropriately. Mm. But that was a lot going on, and there was also a huge communications component of this, right? You've got to get the trust back of 25 million customers, and it's not in a ISO. They're you could say they're kind of captive customers, but they can definitely fire your bosses, and so there's whenever they go vote next. So that was also a big part of the overlay of this is you've got to regain the trust of your customers. You've got to make massive changes, explain what those changes are so they understand and at least tentatively support them. And all of this is not going to be cheap necessarily, or at least in the short term. Mm-hmm. So the communications component was another huge overlay. And it was certainly an area that we needed improvement, ERCOT needed improvement on. And it was something that we worked hard to improve.
So you jump in, and this is sort of an amazing lesson in crisis management when you think about your role here. But did you find yourself saying, okay, look, I'm here, give me a certain amount of time, I'm going to hear from everybody, but then I'm going to propose with everybody's input the way forward? Like, did you have a hard time just trying to keep people calm? Like, no, let's don't make drastic, we got to take some actions, but hold on, we got to think through what we're doing here and let me get how did you manage that part of it?
Complete triage. Because people also forget the massive series of work sessions we did. Uh-huh. And that was very much an effort to both get all of the new PUC commissioners, we're all new, up to speed, up the learning curve, but also part of it was just so we could have one big meeting instead of 5 different meetings and just get the stakeholders or whoever the engaged party was. All input is welcome. There are no bad ideas. We want to consider all of them. And so we spent, dozens and dozens and dozens of hours, probably over hundreds of hours in those work sessions where there was no formal action. It was just pure dialogue. And so that was a lot of work and sometimes very contentious, but that was a very efficient way to get all the commissioners engaged with all the stakeholders and really get all of those ideas out on the table. And just like any industry with longtime incumbents, there's always sacred cows and there's always favored policies and everybody's kind of got their predetermined position. And so a big part of it, once we got to the fall of 21, was like on winterization, we got to move fast. Yeah. On the things on transmission, we got to move fast. We approved that AEP line in South Texas in lightning speed. I can't imagine any utility line in America.
So what was that? Sorry, that was a line going.
Sure. That was the third major line from all of mainly the wind power in the Rio Grande Valley up to the San Antonio and the rest of Texas. There are only 2 lines now. And so it was a major upgrade to that part of the transmission system. It had been on the books for a long time, but that's kind of where when I refer to kind of not worrying about sacred cows and having a fresh look, everybody kind of fought about that line. Do we need it? Do we not? And you have a whole slew of fresh faces on the commission, and this is going to be a 10-minute decision. Yes, we need the line.
Go.
Gavel, move to the next thing. And that had been kind of backlogged for 5 years or something. And so things like that moved quickly on market design, things like that. We had more time, but a lot of it was, and a lot of the work sessions we did were just the benefit was forcing everybody to put their ideas out in the open, stake your ground. Can't tell you what the winning idea is going to be or set of winning ideas, but you have to stake your position. You have to do it publicly, and we're all going to talk about it publicly.
It's funny because this is it's an engineering problem and it's a policy problem. So like engineering was like, hey, bring me any idea you have to wire something different, change something, add something, tweak something. Yeah, interesting. Mike?
Peter, just fascinating story. And I think sometimes when you have crisis, it may actually be an opportunity to really kind of position yourself for the longer term. And I think your point of this is sort of a corporate turnaround is a perfect analogy. And the thing it kind of said to me is when you talked about the AEP line, I think about Germany, during, when they had the gas issue. Regas facilities couldn't be put up, for years and years, 6 months they get put up, okay? And it just shows that when you get into crisis mode, all this permitting issues and stuff like that just goes to the wayside and things can get done. And so you hate to go through that crisis, but I want to kind of talk about, like, I think we're in a better position. Texas is in a better position because the next 4, 5, 6, 7 years, there's going to be dramatic demand growth, dramatic power growth. And I think if we had that model that we had 3 or 4 years ago, entering this period of demand, we'd be in a really, really difficult situation. We'd probably be facing the same situation. So when you think about it, just the institutions, the way they're turned around now, they're in a different position. Because I remember, you know, Wall Street always was like, at some point, ERCOT's going to have some issues. PJM's the best, MISO's the best, and this is why they have capacity markets. We seem to be in a lot better position versus those markets now. I mean, maybe kind of talk about that a little bit.
Great point, and I'll say it's a two-sided coin. In many ways, in most ways, ERCOT is more reliable and more stable than it's ever been. Yep. And I'm sure y'all have heard me say that in press conferences before. But we did, and a great example of this, and why Texas is different despite the football results last weekend. Between the time we showed up, kind of day one in office, and November of 21, we were hustling on all the work sessions. We were hustling on every possible winterization, on every possible metric, on more conservative grid ops, and how do we manage offline generators, and how do we manage the kind of reserves as we like all of it. The DOE and our federal counterparts in Washington, in that same, call it 9-month period, came up with a checklist of everything that ERCOT needed to do in response to Winter Storm Uri. And I'm sure they vetted it across different departments and, you know, the White House, and everybody had a look at it. And so by November of 2021, they published and of course sent us the checklist of kind of wag your finger. This is what you need to do, ERCOT. In the same period of time, we had already completed everything on the checklist, including completely new leadership at the PUC, ERCOT, and literally everything on the checklist had been completed. So moving fast in those times is hugely important to make sure they don't happen. So that's everything from winterization, all of the different lists of reforms, working on firm fuel for the wintertime, expanding the transmission grid, all of those things, hardening our generators. So we've made our grid much more reliable than ever. That being said, we're also still incredibly dependent on renewables. Yep. And I'd said this in my last press conference at the Public Utility Commission, is the load growth at that point, going into that summer of 23, was at the point that we could no longer meet projected load growth with just our dispatchable resources. So if wind is generating and solar is performing, no problem. But if we get one of those low wind days and those low solar days, or cloudy in West Texas, but it's still hot and sunny in Houston and Dallas, and the AC is cranking, but the solar generation is derated in West Texas, we're going to have a problem. We could handle it before, but load growth has outstripped our dispatchable fleet capacity, and so that's still the case, and even more so. And that's not to say wind and solar are bad; they're just different. And so being realistic about that is something that I had to learn very quickly. And that was part of not having any preconceived notions or preconceived ideas when I showed up. Just give me the math, give me the engineering, and we'll work from there.
But it just seemed like, the point I wanted to make, it seemed like the PUC, the legislature, and ERCOT, they were all doing their own thing, right? And now it's kind of, and I think a lot of that was focused on just keep power costs low as opposed to reliability. And it seems like now reliability has now jumped up to the forefront as well as cost as well. And sustainability, sustainability is still big, but those other two issues seem like they're priorities. Is that?
Exactly right. And Brad Jones had a great way of putting that. Before the storm, the acronym was CARE, clean first, affordable, then reliable energy. Yeah. As soon as you endure a tragedy like that, it instantly switches to RACE, big R, reliability, in bold. Then we'll talk about affordable, and then clean energy. And you're absolutely right. It switches instantly, and none of it matters if you don't have power. None of the rest matters.
think to stay on kind of the forward-looking, we're on the Texas load growth has been pretty significant, but no matter whose numbers you look at, it looks like there's certainly potential for another step function change higher over the next half decade. You talked about the unique structure of Texas. Maybe just talk about the pluses and minuses of that structure as we're entering a period where we're going to need to expand resources pretty significantly.
As you heard with the example of the list of to-dos from the DOE, when we need to move fast, we can. And back in 2021, everyone from the governor to the legislature, the PUCT and ERCOT, once we got past the tragedy of the storm, moved very quickly and did an incredible job hardening and stabilizing our grid. And like I said, it's more reliable than it's ever been. But we're facing incredible growth, like you said. And even if the forecast for 2030.
If it's not 50%, what if it's 20%? It's still a big number.
I mean, it's still a staggering number. Like we need another 50, 60, or 60,000 megawatts by 2030 for summer peaking, even if that's off by 50%. Yeah, choose your handicap. It's still what I've got to think is an unprecedented growth rate for any power grid ever. And so that's the next challenge. And that's going to take a lot more transmission, a lot more dispatchable power, and we need it quickly. That'll take some improvements on permitting, siting, and that needs to happen very, very quickly.
Is there anything with the structure in Texas that should advantage it or disadvantage it? As we seek to permit and build a lot of these things. I mean, it's pretty commercially minded state, but we still have got government overlay, or federal government overlay, and Clean Air Act, et cetera. But just how do you think about the permitting process of dispatchable and non-dispatchable?
The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality a few years ago did a great job reorging their air permitting division. And so that's been a big improvement for generation and development in Texas. There's not much you can do at the state level about the federal overlay. I hope the legislature starts taking a more proactive lead in nuclear. And again, kind of in the nuclear world, all roads lead to the NRC. Not much you can do about that at the state level. But there are some other things that can be done to at least signal to the federal government that we do want nuclear in Texas. It is a big part of the answer. So I know the PUC is working on that with the support of the legislature now. So hopefully we'll see some good reporting and studies out of them soon.
So one question, Peter, I think what we noticed, because we've enjoyed talking about power systems around the world. And we had this one lady, she was fantastic, Meredith Engwin, who wrote this book called Shorting the Grid. And it was a study of like the New England PUC and its decision making. But my point is, a lot of these issues you're talking about are, okay, given what we have, we need to fix it, and we need to make it more reliable, and then we need to think about the rules that are going to make it reliable in the future. But there's this, and it's that second part that's really interesting, because people are always adding to the grid. There's a function where you're making the grid better, but then there's the always adding. And what we noticed in Meredith's book is there was this, when she talked about PUC decision making, I just remembered it as this. She'd say, you don't want to be that person who says, I want a coal plant because we might have a blizzard, and if there's a blizzard, I'd just soon have a coal plant. And people they don't want to be that person who's saying, I like coal in a certain instance. There's a long way of asking, how do we fixed what we had, but how did you start thinking about, okay, how do we not get back in this ditch because we build the wrong kind of system as we're trying to meet all this power need? And that would be a system that's composed of like not the right mix of flavors.
Sure, and that's a challenge that grids all over the world are going to be facing sooner rather than later. And in a lot of ways, because of the tremendous growth in wind and solar in Texas, we're kind of the grid of the future. We almost
got there sooner.
Yeah, no, we did.
We did get there sooner.
We did, and we're the grid that the rest of you think you want to look like. We've had to learn some hard lessons from that, and so we still have work to do on that. And it takes an all of the above approach. Wind and solar have been the topic du jour for a decade now. And of course, the IRA is a big part of advancing that, I'm sure, for another decade. And they have some tremendous benefits. And they're self-contained supply chain. I don't have to worry about my at one point we had labor strikes on the coal, on the rail line shipping coal. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, I get a call in my office like, you're not going to believe this, but we got to derate the coal plant because we can't get coal. Don't have to worry about natural gas physically getting there, the weather damaging the natural gas system. You don't have to worry about commodity prices, right? It's when natural gas goes to $9 because somebody in Europe has a dispute. That's a huge commodity risk for the ratepayers. Don't have to worry about that with wind and solar. It's zero cost marginal unit. Self-contained supply chain, very diversified footprint, so there's no single point of failure. All great benefits of those resources, but they don't have an on switch. And at the end of the day, infinity windmills times zero wind is zero power, and the sun sets every night. And so that's part of, I had to learn that we have to be realistic about renewables. They have great benefits, and I think there's better ways the federal government could have incentivized those. And so we learned pretty quickly that when you have that many renewables, you've got to make sure, even if they work 95% of the time, unless your population and your customer base is willing to have blackouts 5% of the time, you still need to match your peak load in vulnerable times with dispatchable. And that can be gas, that can be nuclear, that can be batteries, but we've got to be realistic about the reliability needs of our grids.
Do you think in a weird way, this is a weird question, but Texas, that was such an awful tragedy. I don't want to take away from how terrible it was, but Texas experienced that. It was terrible, but it woke us up, mm-hmm. right? And then we started making some of these changes. Some of these other jurisdictions, California or a Germany, or pick some of these places, they have not had this moment to rattle them. So in a weird way, you would never wish that on anyone. It was terrible, but it did wake us up. What do you think about other jurisdictions waking up to these same problems and saying, "Wait a minute, time out. What are we doing here?"
I mean, Lord, I hope they don't have to have the wake-up call we did. I mean, that was truly, that was a devastating loss of human life. Many hundreds of people. Yeah. And almost backbreaking for the Texas economy, which would be backbreaking for the U.S. economy. I mean, that's just the nature of the way our economic system is structured. So I hope nobody else ever has to endure that. And I honestly hope that other jurisdictions and ISOs can learn from the hard lessons we've had to learn.
Did you get a lot of inbounds as this played out and you started making all these changes where other power systems leaders are calling you and saying, "Hey, can you walk me through what you guys did because I really want to learn"? Surprisingly not,
unfortunately. I've had some initial conversations with, as kind of my return to private sector life, I had some initial conversations with advising foreign power grids that recognized that we've learned some hard lessons. But within the U.S., not really. And I'll also point out that since 2021, we've had no system-wide outages in ERCOT, but there have been multiple system outages in PJM, the East Coast, Carolinas, Tennessee. So not only is Texas better than we've ever been, but we're still performing when, with that change in focus on reliability, we've provided system-wide reliability since that tragedy, while other parts of the country have not, including many hundreds of thousands of people without power over Christmas 2 years ago.
So isn't this seems like an irony that kind of comes out as sometimes is when you focus on, let's say the top focus was decarbonization, and then you get a certain kind of system that looks a certain kind of way. But it also leads to people, like if that system goes down or if you can't rely on that system, you put in more diesel backup, you do all kinds of things. So I think one of the things we debate around here is is the irony is if you put decarbonization first, it's not even clear you get the best decarbonization. Because if you have a more reliable system, even though if on the face of it, it has fewer renewables, if it's more resilient, it's not going to push you into a situation where you call on resources that are, quote, less clean. Like, is that something that comes up in your world?
Absolutely, and I've actually worked with Bill Flores on this after one of our summer 2022 grid events where we had 2 conservation notices in 1 week. And it was a Monday and a Wednesday. And on the Monday conservation call, we got a great response statewide. Like the ballparks opened the roof, and so they wouldn't run on AC even though it was hot. And you could see it in the grid operating data. Tremendous response, and that's part of the improvement in communication and rebuilding trust. And like, we don't like to do this, but every once in a while, this is a lot cheaper. Conservation is a lot cheaper than, a couple $1 billion new power plants. The second time we did it the same week, very different response. No, you get to do this once.
Oh.
And we'll cooperate once. We did not get a response the second Wednesday. And so
this was in 22, you said?
Summer of 22. And that was the record-breaking summer before the next record-breaking summer of 23. And so Bill had the great idea to put down the actual operating data, and that was the Wednesday was one of the days where we had clouds in West Texas that derated the big solar farms up there. Still hot and sunny, bright and sunny in Houston and Dallas. ACs are still cranked up, and we had I don't remember the exact numbers, but like 13% or 10% of total installed capacity of wind across Texas. 30,000 megawatts. We were getting maybe 6, and that uncut it. And so we were right on the brink of rolling outages. And so Bill had started it and had ERCOT do take the same operational metrics, 13% wind. I think we went from 80% solar to 60% solar output. Apply that to a 100% renewables only grid. And you go through the exercise and and you end up having to have just a staggering amount of batteries, like 60 gigawatts of batteries to meet that demand on 2-hour durations. And I mention all that because it's an important part of being realistic about this. It's not that renewables are bad, but we have to be realistic about reliability, because at the end of the day, the one thing your customers care about most and can't live without is reliability. And I presented that in a case at Stanford Engineering School, and one of the students in the front row said, well, if we have to have backup diesel or we have to have backup for everything at some point, and she asked very innocently, like, why did we bother with this other stuff? And then there's obviously a lot of reasons why we focus on real estate, but that goes to my point earlier, like there's a better way to do the renewables. And this is something where I hope the federal government really kind of gets its act together. The financial incentives are great, but there's been, from what I can tell, no focus or understanding of how power grid systems work. Mm-hmm. It's just kind of dumping wind and solar out there. If we could have a 1-to-1 install ratio, because remember, they're supposed to offset, right? The whole duck curve is like, that doesn't just magically happen. So have a 1-to-1 install. If you're going to build 100 megawatts of wind, I need 100 megawatts of solar. And I need that within the same zone, because it doesn't help me in El Paso if I'm in Dallas. So things like that would help tremendously.
So a rule like that would be, wonderful for reliability, and then we'd get a system where you use the wind or solar when you could, and then you had the gas always there, and so on and so forth. But also, doesn't an approach like that, like are we just headed into higher power costs kind of period as a society?
You'd hope not, but I think we are for a time being. But
like we're going to go up until we get the reliability we need, and then from there we might be able to improve it back down.
My hope is always that if we set the rules of the game, of the marketplace, and let the market function, don't interfere with the market, very clear boundaries, very clear rules of the game on market design, market participants, how they can participate, all of those things, and step back and let a market function, then the cure for high prices should be high prices, and the cure for low prices should be low prices. If high prices should be that signal to build, and then once we overbuild, and the oil sector is a great example of this. I mean, that's the traditional the boom and bust of the oil sector. That's exactly the way it's supposed to work. In the long run, that works out great for customers. And in Texas, there's no reason with the ocean of natural gas that we're sitting on that we shouldn't have the most cheap, abundant power in the world. And all of the benefits that flow from that throughout your economy, throughout your daily life. And so I think that's a big part of it. I mean, that's the way we should, the state of Texas and America should be in that situation where the industry may have some volatility, but for the end customer over the long term, it's a pretty reasonable cost. Yeah. We're not there right now, and I think and one of the things we need to recognize and move towards is, again, being realistic about renewables, and PJM's finally kind of waking up, I hope, on the ELCC, and the world doesn't work on averages. And we need to be realistic about pricing renewables differently than dispatchables. And just at a high level, the most basic level, crude oil and Henry Hub both can generate BTUs, right? No one would ever think about trading Henry Hub and WTI on the same market, right? And there's a lot of different ways to do it. Everybody has an opinion on what the best way to do it is. It could be capacity market, it could be something else. But I think we need to figure out a way to have different pricing mechanisms for different forms of generating megawatts, just like natural gas and WTI.
These other systems, and I know that this is an unfair question, but whether it's countries in Europe or other parts of the U.S. or Canada, et cetera, do you think it's the case that a lot of the people in charge, they know the issue, but they just kind of find it hard, like, are we really going to step to the mic and say we want to build more natural gas? And am I really going to say I don't want to close that coal plant? Or am I really going to say, let's write the check for the big nuclear? Is it a lack of, to what do you attribute some of the change we're not making? Is it because we need some more systemic education? Or is it just because someone says, I don't want to be the person to step to the mic and say that?
I'd say it's two things. Mainly, it's the political will hampered by incumbent interests that kind of all systems have, and the kind of blessings of nature that a lot of people have been living on borrowed time from. Like, what does the California power grid look without the Pacific Northwest hydro? What does the European grid look like without the Nordic hydro? We don't have the blessings of that topography in Texas, so we haven't. What does Europe look like without the French nuclear fleet? So a lot of these, there hasn't been the political will, and because of those,
there's some star athletes that kind of keep it going,
right? And so with and those, you can't make those bigger. So eventually, that's why I say it's borrowed time. Eventually, you can't make the Pacific Northwest hydro dams much bigger at all, and the same with the Nordic. So I think it's the combination of those two things. And so this load growth, here we don't have those. So that's also part of a forcing mechanism to drive our willingness to change. And eventually the political will change, whether by choice or at the voting booth in these other jurisdictions. I don't know which, I don't know when, but it's, like you said, at the end of the day, it's an engineering problem.
Peter, we had Bill in here last week, and I think he was educating some kids from North Carolina, from the University of North Carolina, and he talked about batteries, and it kind of jumped out at me in one of the charts he showed. The amount of battery growth on the grid in ERCOT is going to be huge. It's going to be historic, and it's going to even surpass basically wind and solar. I think wind is just really not going to be growing that much. Do you get concerned, you only have 2 hours for these things to be up, that we're going down this road again where we're thinking that this renewable, these batteries they're being painted as renewables, or being painted as this is the direction we have to go, that we're going to get ourselves in trouble again because we're relying on 2-hour power, to be honest with you?
It all goes back to how the system is managed and the market is designed. And if you can match up your reliability goals with the market incentives, then we'll be fine. And that's one of the big challenges facing the PUC and the legislature ahead. And that's at the end of the day, that's the fundamental job, right? Identify your reliability goals and align your market incentives with them. And that's going to be a big challenge.
So you see,
and you're right. The batteries are great for a while.
So you see, like the legislature, PUC, ERCOT, they're kind of generation agnostic now. That they're saying, okay, we just need to have reliability now. I mean, is that the difference now, where they say, beforehand, just keep growing solar, keep growing that, because we have this agenda, we want to be the renewable guy, and now it's really switched where everybody's aligned now, where we're not going to be in the position again.
Absolutely. Now the focus is completely reliability.
Yeah.
And there's no silver bullet for this, right? Like if there was an easy answer, everybody would have done it by now. But,
and I think we have to say that because we're attracting a lot of new industry in the state. We cannot have the grid go down. And so that's got to be a big sell for these guys, right?
Absolutely. But also remember that because of the low barriers to entry, the ERCOT generation interconnect queue is notoriously fickle. Y'all are familiar with that. And whether it's batteries or any other new resource, you have to hedge your bets by tracking the revenue. There's probably 8 different revenue streams in ERCOT. And so batteries kind of got to the saturated the supply of FFRS and RRS, and battery revenue started dropping. ECRS finally got set up. We're back, baby.
Yeah.
And now that growth is starting to get to the end of that, and there'll probably be some pricing pressure pretty soon on that. And so we'll see how that plays out. But right now, everybody's in the battery interconnect queue because they see ancillary service pricing for batteries.
Exactly.
And it's fantastic. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, we've had, 2023 was a screaming hot summer. But then we had a very mild winter going into 2024, an extremely mild winter in this recent winter, an extremely mild summer this summer. Mm-hmm. And so power future prices have been kind of in the gutter. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at a peaking gas turbine or a battery that's got the ancillary services gravy train,
that's right.
Sign me up for that battery.
Yep.
I don't think all of the dynamics we've talked about tell me those kind of depressed power futures aren't going to last.
Yep.
And even if the forecast is off by 80%, it's still a huge amount of power in the next 5 years. So, that'll change over time.
Yeah.
I think we'd be remiss not to ask some water-oriented questions, just given your experience there. I mean, the dynamics of population growth, industrial growth. You've got desal plant down in Corpus that essentially stirs up fishermen. You've got flood infrastructure. We got droughts. Kind of a whole soup of water around Texas. But maybe talk about some of the critical path items we need to solve over the next couple of years.
So the two I'd identify at the high level are bridging the flood drought gap and helping bring proper valuation to that. One of the kind of holy grails of the water industry is figuring out how to properly identify the cost of water, cost of extraction, cleaning, and conveying. The price it is sold for is what you pay at your house, and the value of end use. And those are all very different numbers. And like in the oil and gas business or even in the power business, those are more closely aligned, right? And so, ultra pure water used in low volume for a $20 billion chip fab is very different than water used for washing your car once a week. And maybe you don't need to wash your car once a week in the summer. right? So how do we design policies, economic signals to reconcile that? And when you kind of step back from there, that value chain of within the water supply universe completely gets flipped on its head in the flood world, because in a drought, an extra acre foot of water is priceless. If you're a chip fab, the price is infinity, or it's $20 billion, right? Or I'm shutting down my $20 billion asset. In a flood, not only is it not worth anything, I'll pay you to get it out of here, or I'm going to have to shut down my $20 billion chip fab. And so it's in a weird way, it's a hugely volatile commodity, and kind of the 20th century version of bridging that gap is reservoirs. Big hole. When there's too much water, we fill it up, and when there's not enough water, we let it out. And so a big part of figuring that out is or evolving water supply, both in Texas and around the world, is iterating and evolving that to aquifer storage and recovery, reuse, desalination, and then that gets to the second big theme, is the interrelationship between power and water. The biggest restriction on desal, potable reuse, cleaning, conveying water, is the cost of energy, right? And even if you can get economic desalination on the Texas coast, where we don't, down here in Houston, we don't have a water problem, we have a salt problem. It's really expensive to get it up to Dallas and Austin. Yeah. So the better we get at cheap, abundant power, the better we're going to get at clean, reliable, abundant water.
Yeah, fantastic. I only had 10 more questions, but we're running out of time. I guess one I was thinking about is, so you're a Chicago finance guy, Stanford MBA, so you're a markets guy.
That's what they tell me.
Yeah, well, you seem like a markets guy. And so many of the things we talk about in energy and in environment and climate and all that are, sometimes they're mandates, sometimes they're sticks, sometimes they're carrots, there's all this. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of market intervention is a broad theme of it. And so do you think in here as a markets person, because we've made some good improvements in Texas, and maybe you could say the government's got more involved with like the natural gas fund, et cetera. But I guess my point is, what is the hope you would convey to other markets people that we're going to toggle back towards more market-oriented solutions to many of these problems? Because we've really gotten enamored of state-sponsored solutions in the last few years for a bunch of reasons.
I'd say, I'd repeat what I said earlier: set the rules, let the markets work, and let entrepreneurship run free and do what it does. And it's hard to find a better example of that than the fracking revolution, which, by the way, has been the foundation of all of the cheap natural gas, and American energy independence. Be realistic about all resource types, not just renewables, right? Natural gas plants have force D rates. They're incredibly complex machines. Be realistic and be realistic about nuclear, whether it's small modular reactors or bigger loads. Like all roads lead to the NRC, and until we get that cleaned up, it's not going to be done at scale. SMRs are great, but we're going to need 50,000 megawatts just in Texas. So we're going to need some higher octane units than that, and be very proactive in adjusting the regulatory regime to the realities of the marketplace. And y'all are well aware of the co-location theme going on with data centers and especially nuclear plants. And in some cases, the incumbent TDUs have contested what is a very operationally and capital efficient idea, because there's a cost allocation issue in some cases, and there's a problem of our traditional revenue generation mechanism is being avoided because we're not building more transmission. And so we can't, not only do we need to unleash entrepreneurship development but we can't punish good ideas by saying you were too efficient, And I don't know, that's a really tricky one. But the business model of regulated utilities building to infinity to sustain their business model can't keep up. They can't keep up with our data center growth and the load growth. And so I think that's a topic that's not covered as much and is extremely difficult to figure out, but is going to take some really clever regulatory minds to figure out how we get away from the build to infinity while also appropriately compensating the investor-owned utilities, because they're a hugely important part of this. So we've got to appropriately compensate them without punishing good ideas in the marketplace.
Do you think there should be more leadership at the national level around all this? Or, part of why Texas solved its problem is because it could solve its own problems. And you have that DOE example of, the checklist showed up as you finished it. Like, what's the federal government's most effective role in this?
Well, as a former Texas state official, I'm just required by law to say, stay out of our way.
It's the pledge. It's the pledge.
Right.
You have to say that.
They give you a tattoo, actually, just to keep the feds out of our business. I'm just like leadership in any organization, identify the goals, enable the people and your resources to achieve it, and respond accordingly when you need to adjust course. The federal government is a massively complex entity, but like I said, with the incentive, whether it's IRA or any of these other schemes, at no point in any of them is system reliability or a even mentioned, much less any nod to anyone involved that has ever actually run a power grid or any consideration of how these systems work. And so just starting there, like just telling me how do you think this would play out at a system level? Identifying that would be a dramatic improvement.
It just seems like nobody wants a sort of unnecessarily heavy-handed oversight, but the feds uniquely can see everything that's happening across the country, and they can say, hey, we have these observations.
So the state, the Texas Water Development Board has a great model that I didn't come up with it. This is the genius of the Texas Legislature. The state water plan, there's a $20 billion infrastructure bank that offers low interest loans to mayors and city councils and river authorities and whoever is responsible for providing water in that area. You're not required to do anything, but we'll pay 20 to 30% of the interest on your loan if you meet our criteria for scientifically identifying, quantifying the water resource you're going to use. You go through our regional planning process, and you show us as the state that you guarantee you can provide water supply to your future population for the next 50 years. Only then do you get access to the low interest loans and kind of the attractive money. The state of Texas isn't going to make you do anything, City of Houston or Dallas County or Water District number 3. We're not going to make you do anything. You don't have to deal with us at all. But if you want this carrot, you've got to show me you can provide adequate water to your citizens that you're responsible for. And that's worked tremendously well. Most comprehensive water supply program in the world, as far as I know. There's no reason the federal government couldn't do the same thing with power. We're not going to tell you how to get there, but here's the science, here's the engineering. If you want access to the money, you've got to show us how you're going to provide reliable power for the next 20, whatever, pick your number. And we're going to set the engineering standards, and you don't have to do it.
What is the old expression about, you get what you measure, you get what you ask for? If the feds will start asking for reliability, we would get more.
Show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome.
Okay. Peter, man, this was fantastic. Thank you for taking that role just on behalf of all of us in Texans. It just looked like an awful job, and you jumped in and did it, and God bless you. That was great.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm great, and thank you for the kind words. Couldn't have done it without the support of the governor and a great team at the PUC and ERCOT.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.